My name is Dan Churchwell, and I'm the Associate Director of Program Outreach here at the Acton Institute, and we're absolutely delighted that you're here for our July Acton Lecture Series. None of our events would be possible without the generous support of our donors. JC and Tammy Huizinga have graciously underwritten these Acton Lecture Series, and we're really thankful for their support. We have multiple great events coming up this summer. Please, I refer you to the handout that you received that you can see. We have an Acton Lecture Series both in August and September. And we also are having a wonderful event today, and I want to introduce Bruce Ashford as our speaker today. Bruce is the Provost and Professor of Theology and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author or co-author of over 7 books, including the one he will be referencing today, Letters to an American Christian. He has been featured in Fox News, First Things Magazine, USA Today, and the Daily Signal. And he is also a senior fellow in public theology at the Kirby Center for Christian Ethics in Cambridge University. He has also spoken at universities, seminaries, and churches across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And I found out last night it's a total of 55 countries he's visited. And when I was talking with Dr. Ashford, I could really sense that he has a very interdisciplinary interest and a love for God's people. And we're really thankful that he is here. He is currently on sabbatical. And sometimes sabbatical, for those of you who know the higher ed world, sabbatical can be a time of rest and relaxation. And there has been some of that. But what I did find out is he has 4 books under contract and is writing on 4 of them, and 7 articles, 6 of which are completed, and the 7th to be done soon. So he is very ambitious, very creative in his writing, and please order his book. We usually have books, those of you who are regulars, please order his book. There was a shipping snafu this time, and we do have them en route, but we don't have them today. If you go into the back, you can order his book for $12 that he is engaging the ideas with today, and we will ship it to you for free. So please do order his book by the end of this, end of the talk. And please, without further ado, welcome with me Dr. Bruce Ashford.
All right, well, good morning, or good afternoon, I think. We've just crossed over into the afternoon. I want to give a big thanks to Dan Churchwell and to the good folks at Acton. I want to start by exploring the work of 2 intellectuals who I think will help explain for us why and how the 21st century is a special challenge to us. And then we're going to narrow down and talk about why it's a challenge to parents who want to catechize and form their children in our 21st century context. So the first thinker is Philip Rieff, and he's had a profound impact on my thought. He was a sociologist. In the 70s, he was a rock star public intellectual on the left. He was on all of the big TV shows, black and white TV shows. In those days, he was in all the literary magazines, and then he basically went underground for about 3 decades. He just sort of dropped off the map. And at the turn of the century, he reappeared with a trilogy called the Sacred Order, Social Order Trilogy, the first volume of which is the best, and it's entitled My Life Among the Death Works. And I want to explain the concept of this trilogy as briefly as I can. I think it's illuminating. So Rieff, as a sociologist, argues that the West is undergoing an unprecedented, historically unprecedented experiment in which a number of its cultural elite, who he calls the officer class, have over the past 50 years sort of colluded, that's probably too strong of a term, but coalesced to try to sever social order from sacred order. So to put that in more ordinary terms, they've tried to sever the influence of a religious ordering or a moral ordering of society so that society can sort of order itself. And what he argued is that historically, all civilizations everywhere have understood that sacred order shapes cultural institutions and cultural products, and those institutions and products then shape society at a higher level. Okay, so sacred order shapes cultural institutions, legal institutions, educational institutions. The family is an institution, familial institution. religious institutions. It shapes institutions, but also products. It shapes the sort of things that our artists produce, the works of philosophy, and so forth. And then those things then shape society. But he said what's happened is we've had a number of powerful cultural actors who have sort of tried to rip sacred order out from underneath social order, leaving social order to float on its own. What Rieff warned at the turn of the century is he said this is already going very badly for us in ways that we haven't even recognized yet, and it's only going to get worse. He said, and what happens is that our cultural institutions and our cultural products have become death works. Then instead of bringing life and vitality to society, they brought death and decay. But he gives us hope at the end of the book, and I think we should always have hope. I mean, there's no good in being a pessimist or a cynic. And he says this. He said, you may not be able to see this, but there's already cracks in the foundations of this movement. That it's already beginning to fall apart, and it's probably not going to gain the upper hand. And he said what the world awaits right now, the Western world, and America in particular, he said, is a people. He doesn't name that people. I'm going to. But he said the world awaits a people who can recover the frightening beauty of the thou shalt and the thou shalt not. The beauty and the power of the moral law. It's awaiting a people who together, through their communal life and their witness, can help recover the beauty of that law. And I want to name that people, and that's the church. We have not done an especially good job, and there have been all kinds of scandal and inconsistency and hypocrisy, but it's up to us. This is what God has called us to do. So Rieff leaves us with hope. Second intellectual is Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher. He's got to be around maybe 80 years old now, so he's seasoned philosopher, and he's published a number of books. I'll focus in on a book entitled A Secular Age. And in A Secular Age, Rieff argues that we live in a secular age. And what he doesn't mean by that everyone in our society is an atheist or an agnostic. He doesn't mean that everyone in our society is afraid to or unwilling to put their religious cards on the table and let people know who they are. It means something very different from that. He says, what he means is, he says, we in the West in general, and he focuses in on Canada and the U.S., he says we have, all of us, including Christians, really begun to live within the immanent frame. What he means by that is that we have learned to manage life without any real dependence upon or real reference to anything outside of this world. And that even the believers among us, we tend to not. We've just been taught to manage life through technology and through means that we have at our disposal in this world. And he said what's happened is that Christianity has not only been displaced from the default position, but is now positively contested by dozens of ideologies and worldviews, most of which promise a salvation that comes wholly from within the immanent frame, from within this world. That the salvation from our ills are provided by a bureaucratic, regulatory, political apparatus, or by or anything but Christ the King returning. And he said the result is that Christianity is viewed as implausible and even unimaginable and even reprehensible, especially our teaching on morality. And so I think Rieff's and Taylor's account, I think there's some real truth to what they say. I don't see it exactly the way either of them do. But I think those two frameworks help us to understand why we might have an increasingly difficult time catechizing our children, introducing them to the Christian faith and forming them in Christian ideals. One unique challenge in a secular era is the devaluation of children. Now, the most decisive and dramatic example of that is the abortion regime. That since 1973, I was born in 74, I was a candidate for abortion. We have killed somewhere between 60 and 70 million children, which is more than the death total of all the world wars combined in the 20th century. So I think that is and it's going to be difficult for us to roll that back, because to roll it back is to admit that we have perpetrated one of the greatest injustices in human history. It would be an act of great shame. We should not underestimate the role of shame. There's some more subtle ways. People who have more than 2 or 3 children, more than 1 or 2 children, are often referred to in certain circles as breeders. I've had a neighbor that referred to me and my wife as breeders. We only have 3 children. It's really not that many. But then another challenge, in addition to the devaluation of children, the one I want to focus on a little bit more today, is that we're beginning to confront a movement to devalue parental rights in the formation of children. It's not a big movement, hasn't had a ton of success, and it may not in the future. I'm not a prophet, but there's a good chance that it will. And this can be seen in recent attempts to elevate non-discrimination laws, which are not enshrined in the Constitution, to elevate them above the free exercise of religion, which is enshrined in our founding documents. We saw this, one place you can see this is in a 2015 document entitled Peaceful Coexistence, in which it's published by the United States Civil Rights Commission, in which the majority in that group elevated non-discrimination over religious liberty, and in which the chairman, Martin Castro, the first time a Castro has come against the Christian faith, but Castro said that religious liberty was basically a mask for bigotry and hatred. And that's why it needed to be demoted. And for him to say that, I mean, we've always known, I mean, that's been in the air, but for him to say that in a public document published by the United States Civil Rights Commission was a real statement. So if we see the continued elevation of non-discrimination and if we also see the continued, if the living document view of the Constitution wins the day, then it's going to be pretty easy to insert rights into the Constitution that aren't there and to take ones out that are there in such a way that puts religious believers at a decisive disadvantage. I think on issues like, when a Christian parents or when a child comes home, in Wake County, a 5-year-old learns about transgenderism and learns about gay marriage and so forth in a number of our schools, one of the most progressive counties in the nation. And so, we can easily foresee situations in which a child, we've already seen some cases of this in the U.S., comes home and wants to switch genders, and the parents say, well, this is, you can't actually create yourself, your body's not endlessly malleable, and that you want to try to align your gender identity with your biological sex, even if that is a challenge for people who have gender dysphoria. Or when a child comes home and says, well, a 5-year-old who would have no ability to know whether they're same-sex attracted or not, has been introduced to it and decided that they want to live that out at a young age. Or just really any of Christianity's teachings that are considered implausible, that people just can't for the life of them understand, that they're baffled by it and it seem like bigotry. There's a couple of books, and I brought them on to show them to you. That there's a number of books that have been published addressing these concerns. One of them is by Melissa Michella. It's published with Cambridge University Press. It's entitled To Whom Do Children Belong? And this addresses specifically parental rights in relation to education and the right to catechize and teach and to have a primary role in teaching children. Another was entitled The Natural Family by Carlson and Marrow. This book interacts with about 200 studies that have been done over the past 20 years. Government agencies, sociologists, psychotherapists, Christians, atheists. I mean, it's a very kind of broad number of types of studies, all of which are concerned with the weakening of the family unit, and some of which are concerned with the weakening of parental rights. And all of them, I mean, it's conclusive. All of the evidence from these studies coalesces to say that if you want your children to flourish, and if you want society to flourish, we've got to recognize the natural family as the most basic unit of society, and we have to guard it and protect it. So, I think when faced with secular age, sometimes we've seen Christians be tempted to sort of timidly disengage, or alternatively, to engage in panic politics, kind of angry, just the circumambient imbecility of our political discourse right now, just kind of opinion pieces and the things that talk show hosts say, that our highest political leaders say, the stuff they let come out of their mouths. We've engaged in a sort of panic politics where we justify any sort of political fighting, any sort of degrading and devaluing language in the public square. We justify it on the basis that it's going to get us a victory of some sort. But I want to offer briefly today, encourage us to take a salt and light approach, unsurprising given that Jesus encouraged us to do so. And then I'm going to give 4 ways that we can do that in relation to children and family in a secular age. So in Matthew 5:13 through 16, Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth." So imagine right now the living Lord speaking these living words to us. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. So Jesus is using a metaphor here, salt, to teach us something. So we in the modern age, we have a hard time understanding the role of salt. Just a few generations ago, if you wanted to preserve meat, you didn't have a freezer. So you would dig a cellar, stays relatively cool underground, and you would hang meat in the cellar, and you would salt it pretty heavily. And the reason the salt could preserve the meat was precisely because the salt was chemically different than the meat. And the analogy is that we are, as believers, are going to be chemically different, if you will, spiritually different than the society around us. And that we have a role to play in preserving our society and also in flavoring it. So the 2 things that salt does. And so by living out the Christian faith, we can preserve our society and give it a better flavor. Historically, we have done that, and we still can be salt, even now, even with the challenges of the 21st century. So let me list 4 ways that we can be salt and light in relation to protecting the family and being able to catechize and form our own children, to raise them in the admonition and the nurture of the Lord, even if it turns out that we have some legal forces arrayed against us, or social pressure, or whatever in the future. Number 1, I think we need to make a compelling argument that the family is the most basic institution in society, okay? And the argument could look a little bit like this. So this is point number 1, and I'm going to give 4 or 5 points under point number 1. The family is a fixed part of creation order. That it is the first institution to appear in the Bible and the first institution to appear in history. It precedes government. It precedes all of the other institutions. It is also a part of the law written on the heart, the natural law, the moral law, Romans 2. That moral law, I think, is encapsulated the best in the 10 Commandments. Although the universals are mixed with the particulars in the 10 Commandments, each of those commandments has a universal that is part of the moral law written on the heart. Honor thy father and mother, that it may go well with you, that you may live long. That there is some real and positive benefit for everyone involved, for mother, father, and child, when the family unit is preserved and when the family members love one another and honor one another. The family is also the source of new life, and that is why marriage is a public good, and in my opinion, should be regulated by the state. And it's also why gay marriage is a category confusion. I want same-sex attracted people to be able to get health care insurance together. I think any 2 Americans should be able to get health care insurance together, and it shouldn't be tied to consensual sexual relations or anything like that. But gay marriage is a category confusion. Marriage is a public good precisely because it's ordered toward procreation and the raising of children. It's the extension of society. It's the way that our nation can move forward. And so when you have children, you have an interest in the future of your country at a level that maybe you don't if you don't have children. And I do think it's interesting that in the European Union, nearly all of their leaders are childless. Very interesting development. We could talk about that a little bit during Q&A if you wanted to. It's a source of new life. It's a source of human flourishing and great joy. That the interconnectedness, let me restate that. Ideally, it's a source of great joy. My wife is a counselor. She counsels survivors of sexual abuse and domestic abuse. And so families often do not experience joy. They experience whatever is the opposite of joy. But ideally, and often and probably usually, families are the source of joy. and some good fights too. I mean, I've got 3 kids. I mean, but joy grows in the midst of those sorts of things. And then finally, family is a bulwark of liberty. G.K. Chesterton said that the family is the one anarchist institution in society, that it appeared before the law, before civil law, positive law, and before the government, and that it stands outside of the law. And it's true that totalitarian regimes come against the family. The Nazis did and the communists did. They come against churches and families and mosques because religious institutions and familial institutions are powerful and almost immovable boulders. And they're woven into creation order. And I will say this, that one thing that we've got on our side is that, you can't contradict creation order forever with impunity. Creation order bites back. And when you try to destroy the family, you're going to experience bitter repercussions that hopefully will serve as warning flags. So the flourishing of the family is the surest indicator of a child's future flourishing. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And also the surest indicator of a society's future flourishing. So we have to, number one, make the argument that the family is the most basic institution in society. Number two, we need to draw upon our nation's religious liberty laws to help protect the family. For example, you saw in the Obergefell case in 2015, the 4 dissenting justices, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, may he rest in peace, and who did I miss? Roberts. All of them expressed at a much higher level, I think, than I've ever seen, grave concern at what that sort of fabricated right could do to religious liberty in the future. We haven't seen that eventuate. It hasn't happened yet, but it could possibly happen. And so what we need to do is, in our coffee shop conversations and in our conversation with anyone to whom the Lord gives us an opportunity to talk, and our Facebook conversations even, or whatever, is to find ways to show the value of religious liberty. What is religious liberty? It is the right to align one's life with one's deepest convictions and to do so freely, openly, and without fear. I hope that most people will see the good in that. And we need to find ways of showing the good. This is part and parcel of living in a law-governed democratic republic. Religious liberty is the first freedom, without which all the other freedoms fall. It's bigger than and more robust than freedom of speech, freedom of association. And once religious liberty falls or is weakened, there's a domino effect. This was the Baptist contribution, a major Baptist contribution in the early years in the United States. John Leland and Roger Williams and others argued for religious liberty. Third, I think we need to not only defend the integrity of the family and the integrity of religion, but we need to argue for a philosophy of society that secures those things and locates them in relation to other institutions and associations. That gives a kind of an architectonic overview of what society ought to look like ideally, how these institutions ought to relate to one another. Now, I draw upon Abraham Kuyper, Father Abraham. I'm a Baptist Kuyperian, which is kind of an exotic animal, kind of exotic species of theological wildlife. You're looking at one today. It's like a duck-billed platypus or something. You may never get another chance to see one. But so Father Abraham, he did something like this. I mean, you guys know Kuyper pretty well here at the Acton Institute. But he said, look, if you look at patterns in history and patterns in Scripture, you put them together, you can see pretty clearly that not only did God create different kinds of animals, for example, He created different kinds of culture, art, and education, and family, and religion, and that each of these kinds of culture, he used a spatial analogy, is like a sphere that has its own center and its own circumference. It has its own center or reason for being. Each sphere of culture exists to contribute something that no other sphere could contribute. That has its own integrity and primacy. But also because it has a center, it likewise has a circumference. And another way of putting that is each sphere has limits to its jurisdiction. The church has limits to its jurisdiction and ought not try to set itself up in a coercive relationship with the state. The state has limits to its jurisdiction And as Kuyper always said, ought not become a gigantic octopus reaching its tentacles into every other sphere. And that goes for each of the spheres. And I think what we can show people is that this is a divinely ordained system of checks and balances, not at the political level, by having 3 different branches of government, but at a deeper ontological level. Not dispersing political power, but it's a kind of checks and balances that disperses cultural power, which is deeper than political power. Politics is only a part of culture. Another philosophy of society is Catholic social teaching and subsidiarity. I mean, very similar in some ways to sphere sovereignty, placing value on institutions and associations. That's more hierarchical than the Kuyperian view, and so there's some differences, but on the whole, it's mostly similarities. And so then number 4, the fourth thing we need to do is to expose the negative effects that will flow from the family's displacement. Now, Kuyper always said that the state should be like a temporary curator, that if it has to step into another sphere, that it only does so briefly to fix a problem and then step back out. And it's a good analogy. I think there are 3 reasons, and we can talk about in Q&A if it's interesting to you. There are kind of 3 categories under which it's okay for the state to meddle outside of its general jurisdiction. And there are instances in which it's okay to step into a family situation. We can talk about that. But in doing so, in exposing the negative effects of the breakdown of the family or the weakening of parental rights, we don't have to just rely on theological or philosophical or legal arguments, and I've touched on those today. There are numerous sociological, psychotherapeutic, economic, and medical studies that demonstrate the holistic good that is done to a child if the child can live within a relatively healthy family unit. I mean, the psychological benefit, the future physical health, physical wealth, happiness, the increasing likelihood that their marriage will last, an increased number of children that they're likely to have. I mean, just the benefits are almost innumerable. Now, the fact that we would feel like we'd have to marshal sociological and psychotherapeutic evidence to say that the family is important is a little bit sad. And it's a sign of how ideological our age is, that some of the most basic facts of creation order have been reinterpreted under heavy ideological pressure. So in buttressing the family, we protect not only children, but also society at large. Because the family is the basis not only for rearing healthy children, but also neighborhoods and cities and nations. So to conclude, circling back to our salt and light approach, in some ways, our secular age is not the ideal context for raising kids in the admonition and nurture of the Lord, but neither has any age. I mean, think about the mid-20th century trying to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord in the Soviet Union. I grew up reading the Prisoner Bulletin, put out by Richard Wurmbrand, that had photographs and news stories 4 times a year about pastors who were ripped from their homes, tortured, killed in concentration camps. Countless millions of mostly Christians were either killed, assassinated, tortured to death, or died after only 3 or 4 months in a concentration camp. That was pretty tough. I think a little tougher than what we're dealing with. But in some ways, this is not an ideal context. But our society will lose much of what is good about it if it minimizes and rejects what the moral law teaches us about the integrity and primacy of the family. And if it minimizes or rejects the aspects of our national life that come from our Christian heritage. Those are real. The social capital that our country had from the churches, as Tocqueville demonstrated, was enormous. And we're losing it and we want to regain it. So in order to be salt and light, we want to argue that the family is the most basic institution in society and that there are parental rights that go along with it. I think we want to leverage religious liberty laws, elevate them above non-discrimination laws, to help protect the family. Number 3, we need to find compelling ways of articulating an architectonic philosophy of society so that there's a logic to it, so that it doesn't look like special pleading, if that makes sense. I mean, people have a kind of an inbuilt desire to have a picture of the whole. I mean, it's what's driven me my whole life. I couldn't really name it until I was probably in my 30s. I want to have an understanding of the whole. So I like Kuyper so much because he helped to provide that. And then finally, we want to warn the negative effects that will come if the family's displaced, and the positive effects that will be accrued if we're able to secure the strength of the family. And we want to remember this: we never despair in any age, no matter what the Supreme Court does, no matter what sort of idiocy issues forth from the highest offices of our land at any given moment, from congressmen who forthrightly come against the faith, or political pundits, or whatever it is that happens, that even though we know that our secular age is in some ways arrayed against us, what we know even more surely is that Christ will return one day to set the world to rights, install a one-world government and a one-party system in which justice will roll down like the water. And so that is why there's no need for cynicism, despair, timid disengagement, panic politics. That we exist we do what we do out of witness and obedience, and as a preview of His coming kingdom. We can't control the outcome. We can't control whether we win or not, but we can control whether we are witnesses, whether we're obedient to Him, whether we're a preview of His kingdom. So let's determine among ourselves that we will commit ourselves to being the heart and strength of every good movement of social, cultural, and political concern, but in particular today, of every good moment to buttress the family and to strengthen it and its integrity and primacy. Thank you. Justin?
Thanks, Dr. Ashford. So per usual, we have times for Q&A, and if you have a question, please raise your hand and then allow Isaac or I to come to the to give you the microphone, and go ahead and speak nice and loudly in the microphones as we're recording this and for the sake of people who are live streaming as well. So, yes, sir.
Thank you. How would you compare or contrast your definition of religious liberty as the freedom to align oneself with one's deepest convictions with Justice Kennedy's interesting observations in the 1993 Casey versus Planned Parenthood, when he says that every individual, freedom means every individual has the right to have their own vision of the world, their own individual interpretation of creation and so on. I don't know the exact quote.
Yeah.
But where's the distinction there? There obviously is one.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think I would say one distinction. Let me back up a little bit before I go to the particular of that. So religious liberty, the free exercise of religion does have its limits, right? So sex cults, for example, there are, we draw the line somewhere there where there's abuse of children. In the past, we have, and maybe in the future, we'll continue to outlaw polygamy. And so the Mormons were not allowed to freely exercise because marriage is a public good. And so there are always some limits. Jihad theology, the free exercise of religion ends wherever the violation of human life starts. And so going back to some of the rulings in the 70s and forward, I think what we were seeing is an attempt to say that a woman has the right to take the life of her child because her view of the world is one in which the child would be an obstacle or the child would be unhappy. Sometimes the argument was located on the well-being of the child. The child will not be able to live well because I won't be able to take care of the child very well. Other times it was the woman herself saying something like this: listen, there is going to be a life that ends if I have this baby. It's either going to be the baby's life or my own. And that's the pain that many women feel with an unwanted pregnancy, is that it looks like it's the end of their own life. There's some studies that have shown that. But I think what we want to come back and say is that it is never okay to take the life of an innocent human being, that we want to protect the weakest and most vulnerable. Mary Ann Glendon from Harvard Law School put it best, that Roe v. Wade was very similar to the institution of slavery, was an environmental disaster in the moral ecology of our nation. That it was harmful not only for the baby, I mean, it hurts the baby. We know that because of medical technology now. It's excruciatingly painful. And ironically, a baby in a womb in a hospital in America has far less legal protection than an endangered species of bird in a forest outside of the hospital. But it's not just harmful for the baby, it's harmful for the woman. One way that it's harmful for the woman is that it encourages men in a way we don't need any encouragement. It encourages men to be sexual predators and to be irresponsible. And this is why so many women are abandoned and treated as sex objects. Harms the family unit because it teaches the family that it's okay to solve some of your biggest challenges through the use of lethal violence. It's bad for law-governed democracy because it makes a mockery of our claim for justice and equality for all. Think about this. In the 1960s, it looked like we had just sort of turned the corner on some pretty serious forms of racism. And where we would take an entire class of people, black Americans, and say, you can't have the same rights that white Americans have. And a few years later, 7 black gown lawyers, mostly from Ivy League schools, set themselves up as the nation's moral philosophers. Something they're not allowed to be under the Constitution, but they did it anyway. And they said, you know, as a matter of fact, there is an entire class of Americans who will not get justice and equality, and that would be unborn Americans. It's bad for checks and balances in our country, because this was an instance in which the justices inserted a right that didn't exist, treated the Constitution as a living document. Then finally, we would just say that it's bad for society as a whole because it teaches society that it's okay to use lethal violence to solve your greatest problems. And I think that has ramifications that we probably don't have time to talk about today. Was that meandering enough for you? I mean, hopefully that's somewhat helpful. I think Robert George at Princeton, I like his writing on religious liberty, his definition of it. Better than most, and I would recommend it.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Your statement about creation bites back. We don't have to go very far to find examples of that. Like, for instance, China. No women to marry men. Older men and women killing themselves because they've got nobody that cares about them. Nothing is so. It isn't very hard to find examples that we can kind of talk about and point to, but it doesn't seem to make much of a dent in what appears going on in our ideology. Maybe it's partly because of media and other things. What's our positive response to join the fight in a cultural way?
So the example with China is a really good one. I want to follow up on it for a minute and then address your question, which is a matter of strategy. I think even more than tactics, but a matter of strategy. So at China, when China had the one-child policy, you had so many, because men are valued more than women in that society, you had so many women who were aborted. The same thing is happening in India right now. A good friend of ours just started the Invisible Girl Project, is to try to rescue baby girls who are about to be aborted or ones who are about to be sold into this sex industry because they're women. But because men are valued more than women, you ended up with a lot of lonely, older men. But you also ended up a situation in which, I think the history books are going to end up showing this, where China had, where there was a black market created where women were purchased from other countries and brought over to satisfy the erotic desires of lonely men. And this is just an awful situation. So it is true that when we contradict creation order, we can't do so forever with impunity. It's going to bite back. But it's also true that it seems not to make much of a dent. And so this brings us back to the old Catholic Protestant conundrum of how do we approach this? I'm going to say there's a contribution from both. Good thing to say, right? But there really is. The Catholic natural law reasoning, and I use natural law reasoning, but I'm a Reformed Kuyperian. I'll use natural law reasoning. I think it's very important because the creation order And the moral law are a fact, and they're taught by Scripture. And maybe our natural law reasoning will get a hold on people who are captive to ideologies that give comprehensive interpretations of the world that can explain away even some of the most basic facts of creation order. And I think sometimes in interpersonal conversations or in public discourse in a society, natural law reasoning will get traction. Can't guarantee that it will, and often it doesn't. And so I think there need to be certain people making those kinds of arguments. People in America like Robert George at Princeton, or I think Ryan Anderson, or Jay Buchevsky is my favorite. But you also need people who are making arguments from special revelation, because I think what people also really need is they need to know the true story of the whole world. They need to understand the Bible's narrative, its narrative coherence, because it's within that narrative, creation, fall, and redemption, that we do get an architectonic perspective on reality. And ideologies are always religious. Ideologies are inherently idolatrous. As I see it, an ideology just is the working out of an idolatry. Modern political ideologies take some aspect of God's creation and elevate it, ascribe ultimacy to it, absolutize it, and in so doing, it bends and warps our view of reality. And the antidote to that, I think, is to give people the full panoply of Christian teaching. So I think we should be doing both. Think about it. So I've had conversations with, personal, face-to-face conversations with about, I'll just give the example of folks with gender dysphoria. Some of them acting out on it and are fully transgendered with hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery. Some of them not acting on it, just confused and afraid and timid, not knowing how to act in a society where people feel different than they feel. I've had at least 20 face-to-face. And I've had lots of, after I've published articles on the topic, lots of interesting emails that have been sent to me and so forth. But you just really never know which type of argument is going to gain traction. And to my friends who are overheatedly excited about the possibility of natural law winning the day, I'm going to tell you, natural law to a lot of folks in the transgender community looks like special pleading and doesn't get a lot of traction. None at all. It's like we're trying to marshal some sort of fake psychotherapeutic evidence or medical evidence to help support our bigoted religious view. But back to my Reformed friends, I say, you know what? Neither does an argument from special revelation always gain the day. Now, I actually think that I want to use both in combination. And when I use natural law reasoning, it's hopefully so that I can gain permission for them to give me a willing suspension of disbelief so I can invite them into the biblical world and teach them this narrative about God and humanity. I'm a professor. I'm long-winded. That was a stem winder of an answer. Hope it was helpful.
Two questions. One, I'd love to hear more about folks in the EU leadership not having children. And then number two, you mentioned that the family predates any kind of government institution and pretty much every other institution. Mm-hmm. Obviously, marriage does as well. It was created, designed, and defined by God. Mm-hmm. And yet it seems like the church, to a degree, has ceded marriage over to the government. To where the government thinks that, or the general populace thinks, that the government must have created and designed and defined marriage, and now they can just redefine it however they want to. Any thoughts on taking marriage back from government to the church?
Yeah, thank you. So we'll start with the EU. I'm in the middle of a reading project right now. I've discovered a French political philosopher. Can anything good come from France? Yes, absolutely. Not just Tocqueville. But I'm reading a French political philosopher now. His name is Pierre Manent, M-A-N-E-N-T, and an American philosopher named Daniel Mahoney. He's kind of a junior, if you will, colleague of Manent's. And there's a line of reasoning. They're explaining what's going on in Europe. And I want to take a minute to talk about that and then answer your specific question about Europe within the context of that. And so they go back to Auguste Comte, a French philosopher who doesn't get a lot of airtime these days, but Auguste Comte, who's known for philosophy of positivism, also tried to create an organized religion that he called the religion of humanity. And it was a religion without a God. He wrote a catechism for it. Now, he was a dismal failure. Nobody wanted to be a part of his formal religion. I mean, and you can imagine why. It's just weird. The Soviet Union did it too. They made a Bible called the Atheist Table. They had youth group meetings that were modeled after church youth group meetings in America where they sang atheist hymns, how God doesn't exist, and so forth. So there's a tendency to try to do that. Well, he lost, but I think in the long run, Mahoney would argue, and Manon, he won the day among many people in the West who have taken some of Christianity's humanitarian impulses and the command of God to love neighbor as oneself, and they've severed it from Christianity and left it to float on its own. It's very similar to what Rieff argues. And that this humanitarian religion or religion of humanity has its own anthropology. And the anthropology goes something like this, that human beings are basically good. I mean, this is the heresy we find over and over again in history. And the reason there's evil in warfare is because of systemically warped institutions, especially religious institutions and nation states. And so if we can weaken religious institutions, get rid of strong forms of religion, and if we can live in a borderless world, a world without nation states, then we can get rid of war and the worst forms of evil. So I think there's really something to their argument that there's something wrong with this way of viewing the world. That if you want to have a legacy and perpetuate some real goodness in your nation, you need to have religious institutions. You don't need to weaken them. You don't need to weaken families. This is the component part. There's a move in Europe towards being childless, or at the most having only one child, and this is a grand gesture to humanity to save the planet. So there's a weakening of that institution, and then also a weakening of the nation state. That if we can pretend that there aren't any real differences between human beings, and that there's just sameness, and we can get over having nation states, that we can just have peace. But I think Scripture teaches us something different, that we're formed in families, and that we're actually formed within nations. We haven't always had nation states historically, but there's got to be something between the local and the universal. And there are a number of arguments for that, but there's a way that our identity is formed that can't be formed on the global level. And there's also a problem with allowing power to centralize over the entire globe, rather than allowing power to be held in smaller units. And I hope this makes sense, that the move to sort of weaken the family a little bit, which I think I don't know exactly how to make the connection with the leaders being mostly childless, but I sense that there is a connection there. And the move to weaken strong forms of religion, the move to weaken the nation state, these are bad moves, and we need to call them out publicly and put forth a better model. We see it happening a little bit in the U.S., not nearly to the extent of the EU. When I spoke so I was at Cambridge this last year and gave a talk, and when you speak there, it's here comes everybody. I mean, in the crowd. In fact, the first Q&A person said, well, I never thought I would say a nice word to an American Republican, but thank you for your talk. I don't agree with it, but you seem like a nice guy. I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, but it's just very, very different stuff in the air there. I mean, for me to say that there's a value to the nation state came as a shock to so many people in the room. Now, Europe's had a different experience than America. They have seen wars of religion, which were really wars of nation states in the aftermath of the Enlightenment. Nation states using religions to help each other, in war against one another. And they've seen the 20th century. They experienced Nazism and fascism and communism in ways that we didn't. And they saw nations in World War I standing in trenches, shooting each other with machine guns for years on end. And so they have something in their psyche that we don't. But I don't think the solution is to weaken institutions. And it's interesting. Manon argues that in France, that there's an unwillingness to deal with the real political problem of how to grapple with a growing Islamic population. And he says, because if you recognize that Muslims are actually different than you, it ruins the narrative. You have to retract a narrative that's been building for 100 years. And that they're just viewing Muslims as autonomous individuals who contribute to the economy, not recognizing the fact that Muslims pledge allegiance to an ummah, to a brotherhood that transcends France. And so he says that Christian citizens and Muslim citizens need to be able to speak openly and hammer out a working political compromise rather than ignoring the differences and pretending that they don't exist. And you had a second question.
Marriage coming back to the church instead of being...
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of disagreement on this. I mean, someone like Ben Shapiro, for example, says the government should be out of the marriage business. I think that the government should be in the marriage business because marriage is a public good, a public commodity that has to do with the furthering and the perpetuation of society. But the church also has an interest in marriage. And because in marriage, we give a picture of Christ in the church. And so it may be that pastors need to stop being the ones who give the government license, and that both the government and the church have their own interest in marriage and the family. But you are absolutely right. The church, unfortunately in America, often the church takes its cues from the government. And we need to not take our cues from the giant octopus, from the Leviathan, in defining marriage. And we need to find a way to build sturdy and long-lasting marriages within the church so that our witness by word does not contradict our witness by deed. In some cases, when a divorce is preferable or necessary, I think recognize that. I think the Bible recognizes it, but a 50% divorce rate is not preferable or necessary.
Thank you for your lecture. My question is how we as Christians, when we lift up the family and really see it as the center of society, how we do this without moving into a sort of idolatry of family that might leave behind celibate brothers and sisters. And I think especially of how this would affect Christians in the LGBT community who want to live out a traditional Christian sexual ethic. And so your thoughts on that?
Great question. So, it's interesting. So I was single till I was 33, and I was the only professor who was not married. And people tried to set me up all the time. Still remember it. I mean, I would get just blindsided. People would invite me to dinner because a couple would tell me they couldn't wait to hear my stories about when I lived in Russia, or hey, let's talk about this. And I would show up, and there'd be some poor girl who'd been drugged to the table, and my friends teased me and asked me, Ashford, don't you have any game? And even the old people would come up to me, at weddings and say, "You're next," till I started going back to them at funerals, to old people, and saying the same thing back to them. But it gave me a good understanding, I think, and honestly, at that point, I didn't know if I'd ever get married. I'd struck out so many times, and I was 33, but it gave me a good understanding of how isolated and lonely it can feel to be single in a society of married people, especially if you're single and don't want to be. And you're right, we have got to, and maybe it's tricky to do this, to emphasize the fact that God does call some people to be celibate, and this is a good and high and honorable calling. And yet it is not what God calls the majority of people to. And so we have to, I think, do both, and we probably forget to do both. We see a need, and we rush to that need and argue for it and leave another need behind. I think it's kind of a tendency. And so thank you for the question, and I think you're right.
Thank you, Doctor. This is wonderful, and the spiritual battle that we're in, that's what this is all about, right? You used a term, and I think it's really important, timid disengagement. And that is so much of this hostile, secular, disruptive atmosphere we're going through. Rather courageous, thoughtful, strong warriors Coincidentally, right now, you're probably well aware, and I'm curious your comments here. In Washington, Secretary Pompeo, President Trump are leading a religious conference that's remarkable in the things that he is saying and doing. Can you comment on that, please?
You know, I am actually not aware of that conference. We had am I being recorded right now? Yeah, no, I was just going to say, about 9 months ago, my wife experienced a brain trauma, brain bleed, and I basically pulled out of the news cycle for about 9 months. I quit as a political opinion writer, and I have not read the news very much to take care of her. She's almost fully recovered, and so I can't comment on it. I'm embarrassed. I should be up on the news, but just because of the situation, I've missed almost everything for 9 months. I'm a little bit happy about it, actually. It's been a great 9 months in that respect. Okay, yeah. So I'm sorry I can't answer that one, but I'm going to dive back in once my sabbatical's over with. I'm going to dive back in so that hopefully I can answer a question that I ought to be able to answer, like that one. I think I've got maybe time for one more question. They told me that the office linebacker would tackle me at 1 o'clock if I wasn't finished answering. You guys remember the office linebacker? Anybody? ESPN, Terry Tate. That's exactly right. I got a friend right here on the second row. We got any other?
Yes. Hi, over here. The family you mentioned is the bulwark of society. And we can see that education is hijacking the family. And I have a book from the late 1800s from a superintendent of schools, Stetson, who in his book talks about the family being the first form of government, which you have addressed. He also talks about obedience in that same book, in that same paragraph where he talks about that. Do you think that we are being hijacked through education, and then also are parental rights being taken away through the medical field with the forced vaccines that are happening like in California? So if you can address those two questions.
There's at least 3 questions in there. If I forget one of them, let me know. The first one just had to do with, I do want to affirm this, Stetson, you said? You know, the family is a microcosm of society, and we learn the traits of citizenship within the family unit. We learn how to tolerate people that irritate us to no end, right? 2 of my children are learning that lesson right now. We learn to obey authority. My children are learning to obey me even when they don't understand why I'm right and they're wrong in a given situation, or why I've made a judgment call on something. And citizens have to learn that. And they're not allowed to try to they're not allowed to impeach me for doing it. And they're not allowed to foment a revolution where they overthrow the social order in our house because I haven't allowed them to do something they want to do. So we learn the traits of citizenship from within the family. I think that's true. When it comes to parental rights and education, I really, right now, I'm very happy that we still do, in most places, have the right to homeschool our children if we want to, send them to a Christian school, send them to a public school. I'm actually the product of a public school education. My parents were my family was not being recorded, right? Right now? Yes, you are. Okay, maybe, yeah. Yeah, well, we were a little bit financially disadvantaged. I'll just put it like that. And so we couldn't afford private school. But what my parents did is they catechized us after school hours. My parents bequeathed to me an education in the Scriptures. They paid me to memorize Scripture. And they debriefed what we had been taught at school, and they gave a Christian perspective on it. They don't have a college education, but they did a brilliant job of it. They gave me biographies for Christmas. I wasn't always happy about that, biographies instead of, video games. History books, history of the U.S. presidents instead of some toy that I may have necessarily wanted. And so I think we need to do that. I wish that we would have vouchers. If the government is going to sweep in and take 25% 30% of my salary and then redistribute it, it would be really nice if I could get some of that back in the form of tax vouchers. And the people who would benefit the most from that are financially disadvantaged people who would finally have an opportunity to choose. There are wonderful public schools and also wonderful private schools. and also to use that voucher for homeschooling, to buy textbooks and so forth. I hope that we can keep that. The vaccination issue, I think I'm speaking outside of my knowledge if I were to answer that right now. I know it's an important issue, but I'm beyond my bandwidth. There are so many important issues right now that I haven't gotten to that one yet. So I think it's a good question, but I won't take a swing at it right now. Thanks. Thank you all. You've been a great audience. I really, really appreciate it.